Grief is one of the most powerful emotional experiences a human being can endure. Whether it's the death of a loved one, the end of a significant relationship, a miscarriage, the loss of a job, or even the decline of one's health, grief disrupts the very fabric of our identity. It's not a single emotion, it's a landscape, a terrain of shifting, overwhelming feelings that change day to day, sometimes moment to moment. When we lose someone or something deeply meaningful to us, the emotional pain is not just intense, it's often disorienting. People describe grief as feeling like a heavy fog, an open wound, or a psychological freefall. It impacts our ability to think clearly, our sleep patterns, appetite, energy levels, decision making, emotional regulation. The brain, trying to make sense of the loss, may begin looping through memories, regrets, or what-if scenarios. This can result in emotional exhaustion, irritability, and even a form of trauma-related stress. Grief shakes the foundation of who we are and what we believed was stable. For many, this creates a profound sense of emotional vulnerability that leaves them searching desperately for relief. One of the most difficult aspects of grief is the mind's refusal to accept the finality of the loss. This is often referred to as the bargaining stage, but it's not always a conscious negotiation. It might appear as obsessive thinking, dreams where the person is still alive, or an inability to let go of certain possessions, routines, or memories. This phase is marked by an intense yearning, the primal desire to feel connected to what has been lost. People may visit old places tied to the person or experience, replay voicemails or reread text messages, talk to the deceased or imagine conversations, isolate themselves in their room or home. This yearning is not weakness, it's a natural, deeply human response to attachment. But when that yearning goes unresolved, it can lead to prolonged grief and unhealthy coping mechanisms. Grief often creates a chasm between the grieving person and the rest of the world. People don't always know what to say. Friends stop calling. Life moves on around them, but for the grieving person, time feels frozen. The sense of emotional isolation is one of the most painful parts of grief. You might feel like, no one understands what I'm going through. I don't want to burden others. Everyone expects me to be okay by now. I'm just empty. And because of this emotional disconnection, many grieving individuals withdraw socially, avoid community or family events, and suffer in silence. This isolation amplifies grief, making the pain feel even more unbearable. And in this vulnerable state, the mind and body begin searching for comfort, numbing, or escape, which is where addiction can begin to take root. The pain of grief is real, and the emotional wounds it creates run deep. When left unaddressed, those wounds often look for quick ways to close themselves, sometimes through substances or addictive behaviors. Grief leaves behind a silence, an ache, and a longing to feel whole again. In that emotional emptiness, many people turn to substances or behaviors that offer relief, however temporary it may be. Addiction in this context often begins not as rebellion or recklessness, but as a desperate attempt to feel normal again. For someone grappling with grief, the emotional weight can feel unbearable. Substances like alcohol, prescription pills, marijuana, or other drugs may initially seem to soften the pain. Even behaviors like gambling, binge eating, or compulsive screen use can temporarily distract the mind from sorrow. The pursuit of escape offers a momentary sense of calm, relief from racing thoughts or nightmares, a numbing of the sadness and yearning, a sense of control in a life that feels shattered. It's important to understand, addiction often begins with a search for comfort. The grieving individual isn't always chasing a high, they're trying to dull a low. But that relief is fleeting, and what begins as a coping mechanism can quickly become a dependency. Addiction is not just a matter of poor choices or lack of willpower. It's a complex interplay between biology, psychology, and environment, especially when grief is involved. Here is the biological component. Substances like opioids, alcohol, or stimulants flood the brain with dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter. Over time, the brain's natural dopamine production weakens, and tolerance develops, requiring more of the substance to feel the same effect. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and impulse control, becomes impaired. Withdrawal symptoms can create dependency, even when emotional pain is what started the habit. Here is the psychological component. Grieving individuals often suffer from depression, anxiety, PTSD or unresolved trauma, all of which increase the risk of substance use. Emotional triggers such as anniversaries or reminders of the loss can provoke intense cravings for relief. Addiction provides a perceived sense of control or escape, which can feel stabilizing in an otherwise chaotic emotional state. In this vulnerable condition, the brain rewires itself around the substance or behavior, making recovery much more difficult over time. What starts as a brief escape can quickly spiral into long-term suffering, both for the individual and those around them. Now, for the individual, increased emotional numbness, making it harder to grieve in healthy ways. Strained or broken relationships, financial instability, job loss or legal trouble, health complications, liver damage, cardiovascular problems, brain fog, sleep disorders, co-occurring mental issues worsen without treatment. For families and loved ones, watching a grieving person spiral into addiction can be heartbreaking and confusing. Communication breaks down, trust erodes. Codependency often develops with loved ones enabling out of fear or guilt. Children in particular suffer immensely, experiencing anxiety, neglect, or even trauma. Substance abuse doesn't cancel out grief, it compounds it. What was once emotional pain now becomes a multi-layered crisis, impacting physical health, mental well-being, relationships, and the possibility of healing. But there is hope. Even in the darkest chapters, there are ways to rebuild. So, let us explore how mindfulness, presence, and emotional awareness can gently break this cycle, offering peace without a catch. Grief and addiction often seem like separate struggles, one rooted in loss, the other in compulsion. But in truth, they frequently coexist beneath the surface, feeding off of one another in powerful, often unnoticed ways. Grief is one of the most destabilizing experiences a person can endure. In many cases, the emotional intensity of grief overwhelms the mind's natural coping capacity. Without healthy outlets or support, a person grieving may subconsciously seek relief or distraction through substances or compulsive behaviors. This isn't always immediate. Sometimes, addiction surfaces weeks, months, or even years after the original loss. But the emotional root, which is grief, does always remain. Here are some examples of how grief becomes a trigger. A man who starts drinking heavily after the death of his spouse, not to party, but to sleep without crying every night. A teen who loses a parent and begins misusing prescription meds, not to get high, but to stop feeling numb and invisible. A woman who compulsively eats or shops after a miscarriage, not out of indulgence, but to fill an emotional void. The grieving brain is desperate for a sense of control, relief, or anesthesia, and that's exactly what addiction falsely promises. Grief is often accompanied by a constellation of emotions: sadness, guilt, anger, confusion, abandonment, and emptiness. These aren't just sad feelings, they are deep psychological wounds. Unfortunately, society often teaches us to suppress or move on from grief quickly. Many people don't have the tools or the permission to sit with pain, so instead, they self-medicate. Substances provide what feels like a solution. Alcohol dulls emotional sharpness. Opioids bring calm to anxiety. Marijuana numbs overthinking. Stimulants bring false energy when depression sets in. But the relief is temporary and deceptive. What's being suppressed doesn't go away, it festers. The more we avoid facing grief, the more likely it is to morph into chronic emotional dysfunction, depression, or substance dependency. This is the unexpected intersection. Grief is not just a source of sadness, it can become a silent driver of addiction. For many people struggling with addiction, there is an unspoken loss at the core of their pain. A parent who abandoned them, a loved one who died suddenly, a future that was stolen by trauma, a childhood lost to abuse, a relationship that ended without closure. And if that loss is never acknowledged, the addiction becomes a mask, a way to avoid the grief that hasn't yet been processed. This is why so many traditional programs fall short. They treat the substance use, but not the emotional wounds driving it. Healing must include grief work. That means naming the loss, making space for sadness, anger, and regret, expressing emotions in therapy or community, honoring what was lost instead of avoiding it. When grief is processed mindfully, the addictive behaviors often begin to lose their power, because the underlying pain is finally being seen, felt, and metabolized in a healthy way. So, how do we begin to face grief without running from it? Let us examine the tools, specifically mindfulness, support systems, and resilience practices that can help transform pain into purpose and dependency into healing. Up until now, we've explored the emotional devastation of grief, the complex nature of addiction, and how the two often intersect in unexpected but deeply human ways. Now comes the most important part, healing. Because while grief may leave lasting scars and addiction may seem all-consuming, recovery is possible. Not only possible, but achievable, sustainable, and life-affirming. No one should navigate grief or addiction alone, and yet, isolation is often where both thrive. One of the most powerful antidotes to both grief and addiction is connection. Real, compassionate, non-judgmental connection. Support systems can include therapists or grief counselors trained to process complex loss and trauma. Addiction recovery professionals, including those who specialize in dual diagnosis. Support groups such as Grief Share or the Compassionate Friends. AA, NA, Smart Recovery or Refuge Recovery for Addiction. Faith communities or spiritual mentors. Trusted friends and family members who offer presence without pressure. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply saying, "I need help." Professional guidance and peer support can provide structure, tools, and emotional safety necessary to move forward. While no single approach fits everyone, several evidence-based strategies have proven effective for healing both grief and addiction, especially when they are interwoven. Now let's go through a few. 1. Mindfulness-based coping. Practice breathing techniques during moments of intense craving or sadness. Use body scan meditations to reconnect with the body and calm emotional overwhelm. Journal thoughts and feelings to avoid emotional suppression. 2. Daily routine anchoring. Structure reduces impulsivity and gives a grieving mind stability. Induce self-care rituals, hydration, sleep hygiene, walks, stretching. Schedule connection, one call, one message, one check-in daily. 3. Trigger awareness. Identify triggers for grief surges and addictive impulses, like anniversaries, loneliness, or guilt. Create a list of alternative responses for each trigger. For example, instead of drinking, call support friend. Do a 5-minute grounding. 4. Self-compassion and emotional validation. Speak to yourself like you would a grieving friend. Let yourself mourn. Let yourself feel. Drop the shame. There is no correct timeline for grieving or healing. 5. Integrated therapy models, CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy for negative thought patterns. MBRP, or mindfulness-based relapse prevention to manage cravings through awareness. Grief counseling or EMDR to process trauma stored in the body and mind. Healing is not about perfection, it's about intention, action, and support. It's easy to believe that grief and addiction define you, but they don't. They are chapters in your story, not the ending. Recovery begins the moment you say, "I want something better." Every step, no matter how small, counts. One mindful breath, one meeting attended, one day clean, one honest conversation, one acknowledgement of your grief. Over time, these small steps build into something bigger. Resilience becomes clarity, and clarity becomes hope. You can build a life that honors your loss without being consumed by it. You can reclaim joy, purpose, and freedom. Your future doesn't have to look like your past. Finally, let's look at what life can look like after grief and addiction. How mindfulness, gratitude, and purpose can transform survival into fulfillment. Grief and addiction are two of the most misunderstood human experiences. Both are heavy, painful, and complex, and both are often suffered in silence. Why? Because of stigma. Let us go ahead and explore how society contributes to the silence, and how we, together, can begin to change that. In many cultures, grief is quietly tolerated, but only for a short time. After a few weeks or months, people are expected to move on, be strong, or get over it. Prolonged grief is viewed as weakness. Emotional expression is often discouraged. Addiction carries an even deeper stigma. People struggling with substance use are often labeled irresponsible, moral failures, dangerous, hopeless. Rarely are they recognized for what they truly are: hardened, grieving, emotionally overwhelmed human beings. This cultural judgment has devastating consequences. People avoid asking for help due to shame. Loved ones keep silent about their struggles. Communities ignore the emotional roots behind addiction and grief. And worst of all, stigma isolates. It keeps people stuck. To heal as individuals, we must also heal our collective mindset. Grief is not a weakness. Addiction is not a moral failing. Both are human responses to pain, and both deserve compassion, not condemnation. What does compassion look like? Listening without trying to fix. Validating someone's emotions, even when they are messy or uncomfortable. Withholding judgment when someone relapses or breaks down. Asking, "How can I support you?" instead of offering advice. Empathy bridges the gap, us and them. It reminds us we all suffer, we all struggle, and we all need each other to heal. Creating a culture of understanding starts with everyday actions. Here is how we begin. In homes, encourage emotional expression, especially in children and teens. Allow grief to be visible and valid, not hidden. Talk openly about mental health and substance use without shame. In schools, teach emotional literacy alongside academics. Offer peer support groups or counseling for students dealing with loss. In healthcare, train providers to treat addiction and grief as interconnected emotional and medical issues. Integrate trauma-informed care into addiction services. In communities, create safe spaces, churches, community centers, online platforms where people can share stories without judgment. Support harm reduction programs, grief circles, and recovery workshops. On social media, share stories of recovery and resilience. Speak out against stigma. Normalize seeking help. Change doesn't require grand gestures. It starts with compassionate conversations, honest storytelling, and willingness to hold space for pain. Listen, I know recovery isn't easy. There will be days you feel strong and days you feel broken. That is why I created these tools. I've seen how powerful it can be when you have the right support, the right mindset, and the right plan. You deserve a life filled with peace, freedom, purpose, and joy. And you don't have to walk this path alone. So today, make a choice for yourself. Download the free 7-day journal. Dive deeper with the 30-day journal. Master your recovery journey with the ultimate guide to overcoming addiction. All the links you need are right here below the video. You can be a bridge. Whether you are grieving, in recovery, or supporting someone who is, you have a role to play in this healing movement. Let us build a world where grief isn't shamed, where addiction isn't hidden, and where healing is not only possible but expected, celebrated, and supported. The more we understand each other, the more we can uplift each other. And in that space between stigma and empathy, true recovery begins.